Okay, so today we're going to talk about Chapter 6 from the William Stallings textbook. This is external memory. That's if you have the 10th edition. If you have a different edition, the chapter may be slightly different or set off, so be sure to check which edition you're working with. So let's get into the external memory. This is different from the RAM. We'll cover a range of external memory devices and systems, and a big part of the focus here is going to be on magnetic disks. So your internal disk drive and how it's made up and how it works. We'll also explore RAID systems, that's redundant array of independent disks, and we'll look at some other technologies such as solid state drives, optical memory, and magnetic tape, which is oddly enough never really gone away. So let's start out with magnetic disk because this is kind of the most common. And the disk is a circular platter, and it's constructed of non-magnetic material called a substrate, and then that gets coated with a magnetizable material so that you can store the zeros and ones on them. They've recently gone to glass substrates, and these improve the uniformity of the magnetic film surface and increase the reliability. You get fewer surface defects, and that produces fewer read-write errors. If you've ever had a clunky old hard drive that reads things incorrectly, or you hear it scratching around, then you know the frustration of read and write errors, particularly if it's a critical file. And basically, they're more durable than the previous incarnation. So for these magnetic read and write disks, the data are recorded on, later retrieved from the disk via a conducting coil named the head. And in a lot of systems, there are two heads, one to read the data to pick up whether that's a 0 or 1, magnetized or not, and a write head to perform the operation of putting the appropriate charge on the disk. And during a read or write operation, the head stays stationary while the platter rotates beneath it, much like a vinyl record. The write mechanism exploits the fact that electricity flowing through a coil produces a magnetic field. These electric pulses are sent to the write head, and the resulting magnetic patterns get recorded onto the disk surface. And there are different patterns, of course, for positive and negative currents, because we're going to have to read those back off. The write head itself is made of easily magnetizable material, and it's in the shape of a rectangular donut with a gap along one side and a few turns of conducting wire along the opposite side. So it looks a lot like that core memory that we talked about in the previous lecture. An electric current in the wire induces the magnetic field across the gap, which in turn magnetizes a small area of the recording medium. Reversing the direction of the current reverses the direction of the magnetization on the recording medium. Going about it the other way, read exploits the fact that the magnetic field moving relative to the coil produces an electric current in the coil, and then we can read what that electric current is. When the surface of the disk passes under head, it generates a current of the same polarity as the one already recorded. Structure of the head for reading in this case is essentially the same as for writing, and so the same head can be used for both, but oftentimes you find dual head systems. The single head was often used in the old floppy disk and in older rigid disk systems. Contemporary rigid disk systems use different read mechanism, and they require a separate read head. So you have both a read and a write head. And that consists of partially shielded magneto-resistive sensor, and which depends on the direction of the magnetization of the medium that's moving underneath it, that is the disk platter. And by passing a current through this sensor, resistance changes are detected via voltage signals, and you can read in that 0 and 1. So the head, again, is a small device that's capable of reading and writing to a portion of the platter rotating beneath it. You see the platter here. The data is organized into concentric set of rings. Those are called tracks, and you might recognize the term track from vinyl or from music in general. And with a hard disk, there are actually thousands of tracks on the surface. Adjacent tracks are separated by inner track gaps to prevent errors from misalignment. You know, you see the same thing on vinyl. They're separated by a little small moment of silence so that you know where you're at. And then the data get transferred to and from the disk in sectors. And there are typically hundreds of sectors per track, and they can either be fixed or variable length. Most systems use fixed length sectors, but that causes some issues with rotation. And to maximize the storage capacity, we'd like to have the same linear bit density on each track. Modern hard disks use a simpler technique which approximates equal bit density per track, which is multiple zone reading. And the surface is divided into concentric zones. As the disk head moves from one zone to another, the length of the individual bits changes, causing a change in the timing of reads or writes. So physical characteristics of systems, and we can divide disk systems up based on their physical characteristics. So we can classify them this way. There's the head motion, disk portability, sides, platters, and head mechanism. And we'll talk about each of these in the coming slides. So for head motion, there's two different ways to do this. One is a fixed head, which is one per track. This should actually be fixed heads. There's one read-write head per track, and then the heads are mounted on a rigid arm that extends across all the tracks. Whereas a movable head, there's only one read-write head. The head is mounted on an arm, and the arm can be extended or retracted in order to move to the appropriate track and sector. The head motion, if you can have two types here. One is a removable disk, the first one should be non-removable, which is the one that's permanently mounted in the disk drive. And basically, this is the hard disk in your personal computer. The removable disk, which is on the right, can be removed and replaced with another disk. The advantages of the removable disk are you can basically have an unlimited amount of data available depending on how many removable disks you have, and you can move them onto other systems. So floppy disk and zip cartridges, flash drives are all examples of removable disks. And then sides and platters. Is it single-sided or double-sided? And do you have one or more? And so some disks actually accommodate multiple platters. So you can have like 3 platters stacked on top of each other. They could both be double-sided, and you could have read-write heads for each side. For the head mechanism, how does the head read the data? Does it come into contact with it? And you would get this with your older floppy disks. And in fact, you could often hear them writing to the floppy disk. It actually made a noise, so you knew if it was writing. There's also a fixed gap where the read-write head is positioned a fixed distance above the platter, so it doesn't actually touch it. That reduces the amount of wear. And then there's the aerodynamic gaps, which are the Winchester heads, and these are sealed assemblies that are free of contaminants. And they operate closer than the fixed gap. And so they allow for greater data density. And there's an aerodynamic foil that rests lightly on the platter surface when the disk is motionless. The air pressure generated by the spinning disk is enough to make the foil rise above the surface. Other things, disk performance parameters. When the disk drive is operating, we rotate it at a constant speed. To read or write, the head needs to be positioned above the desired track and at the beginning of the desired track sector on the track. One of the performance parameters is seek time, and that's the time it takes you to position to the head of the track. So in vinyl parlance, that's picking up the needle and moving it to the start of the track. The next performance parameter is rotational delay. That's the time it takes for the disk to spin around to the beginning of the sector once you've moved it to the correct track. Block access time is seek time plus latency time and the transfer time. And the transfer time is once the head gets put into position at the right track and sector, the read or write operation is performed as the sector moves under the head. And how long does that take? That's the data transfer portion of the operation. And so here are some typical hard disk parameters from when the book was published. You can see some differences in terms of the Ultrastar HE has a very high capacity, 12 terabytes, but it takes a lot longer for the seek time to get done, and the spindle speed is actually lower than the Ultrastar. So you can see different parameters, and the Toshiba is something that you might have in your laptop if you have a moderately recent computer. Solid state drives are the next part. And if you have a vehicle, you know that moving parts tend to be problematic. So solid state is basically it's not moving. And so an SSD is a solid state drive, and that's made up of solid state components that can be used as a replacement for a hard disk drive. And there's been an increase of these in recent years, and they use NAND flash memory. So one of the problems with NAND memory, of course, is that you can only write to it a limited number of times, but it does have less power needed, and it goes down in terms of cost, and it's also fewer moving parts, which is always a good thing. So, again, as you use it, it tends to slow down as it gets used. And that's because of the, you're writing to an entire block, and you're erasing entire blocks rather than individual bytes. So before the block can be written to flash memory, you have to erase the entire block. And the entire block from the buffer gets written back to the flash memory. So that, can slow things down because you have to erase entire blocks as opposed to doing it at the byte level. And it becomes unusable after a certain number of writes. So there's a need for techniques to prolong its life. One is front-ending the flash with the cache delay to prevent write operations from happening too frequently. You group them after the cache gets changed enough. We're leveling algorithms that distribute the writes across blocks of cells, and bad block management techniques. And finally, some of these actually estimate their own remaining lifetime. Optical memory is another way of storing things externally. You've probably seen these in various forms of CDs and DVDs and Blu-ray. And this slide gives you some of the details of those different technologies. CDs are quite common, as are CDRs. CD read-write never quite worked as well as it should have. The same with DVD read-write. Magnetic tape, oddly enough, has never really gone away. It's still out there, and it's actually improved quite a bit since the ones I showed you during our lecture portion that we had lying around from the 1970s. And there was a recent article in IEEE Spectrum about magnetic tape and its future. So tape systems use the same reading and recording techniques as disk systems. The medium's this flexible polyester tape, and that gets coated with a material that you can magnetize. And they are recorded serially rather than recorded with random access. So basically they're laid out as a sequence of bits along each track, and they get read into by continuous blocks called physical records. And the blocks on the tape are separated by gaps referred to as inter-record gaps. RAID, and I was going to read the, today's video is sponsored by RAID Shadow Legends, one of the biggest mobile playing games of 2019, and it's totally free. But we're not talking about RAID Shadow Legends, we're talking about redundant array of independent disks. And this is basically a way to guarantee that, not guarantee necessarily, but to hedge your bets on corruption of data on an individual disk. So basically there are 7 different levels of RAID, and levels don't imply a hierarchical relationship, but they designate different design architectures. So you have a set of physical disks viewed by the operating system as a single logical drive. The data get distributed across these physical drives in a scheme known as striping. And then the redundant data are, we use redundant data to store parity information. So that it guarantees we can recover data in the event of a disk failure. So if one of those disks fails, we can still recover the data from that disk by having parity stored on the other disk for that individual disk. So the first one is RAID level 0. It's not really RAID because it doesn't include redundancy, so it doesn't have that parity bit. There are a few applications such as supercomputers, and that's when you have performance and capacity as your primary concerns. It's also low cost, but you don't get the reliability because you're not storing the parity bits. So here's RAID level 0. Here we can see the logical disk, and the strips are stored across the 4 different physical disks in a round-robin manner. So RAID levels 1 to 6, and again, if we're doing this in class, I have you count off by 1 to 6, and you get to work with the people in your group to describe that RAID level. And then you come back and describe that RAID in detail. So RAID level 1, basically it differs from 2 to 6 in the way the redundancy is achieved. And it's achieved simply by making a duplicate of the disk. Data striping is used, but each logical strip is mapped to 2 separate physical disks. So you have a backup of each one of the disks. And it can also be implemented without data striping, but this is less common. Positives, read-requests can be serviced by either of the 2 disks that contain the requested data. There is no write penalty. A recovery from a failure is simple. When a disk drive fails, the data can be accessed from the second drive. And then you can take the one that failed out and put a new one in and copy its data from the appropriate disk. Provides real-time copy of all the data and can achieve high I/O request rates if the bulk of the requests are reads. The principal disadvantage is cost because you need to have double the amount of storage that you actually need. RAID level 2 makes use of a parallel access technique. All disks participate in the execution of every I/O request, and the spindles of the individual drives are synchronized, so each head is in the same position on each disk at a given time. And here the strips are very small, often as small as a single byte or a word. There's also an error correcting code that gets calculated across the corresponding bits of each data disk, and they're stored in the corresponding bit position on multiple parity disks. And typically we use a Hamming code that we discussed previously, and the number of disks is proportional to the log of the number of data disks. RAID level 3 only has a single redundant disk, no matter how large the disk array. Employs parallel access with all the data distributed in small strips. Instead of an error correcting code, we have a simple parity bit computed for the set of individual bits in the same position on all the data disks. This can achieve pretty high transfer rates. In the event of a drive failure, the parity drive is accessed and we reconstruct the data on the remaining devices. And once failed drive is replaced, the data can be restored on a new drive and we resume operation. In the event of a disk failure, all the data still available are referred to as a reduced mode. RAID level 4 makes use of an independent access technique. If in an independent access array, each disk operates independently, so they're separate I/O requests and they can be satisfied in parallel. And again, data stripping is used. The strips are relatively large. To calculate the new parity array management software must read the old user strip and the old parity strip. This one does involve a write penalty. Each time a write occurs, the array management software needs to update not only the user data, but the corresponding parity bits. Thus, each strip write involves 2 reads and 2 writes. And the write operations end up being a bottleneck. RAID level 5, this one's a pretty common difference is the distribution of the parity strips occur across all the disks. And those are the ones in gray if you're looking at the little diagram here. And typical allocation is round robin, and basically it avoids the I/O bottleneck. RAID level 6, 2 different parity calculations are carried out and stored in separate blocks on different disks. The advantage is it provides extremely high data availability. 3 disks would have to fail with the mean time to repair interval within the mean time to repair interval in order to cause your data to be lost. It does include a substantial write penalty because each write affects 2 parity blocks that are going across multiple disks. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching.